Welcome to Keyfest 2021, presented by Casa, the best in Bitcoin security. My name is Nick Newman, and I'm the CEO at Casa, and I'm excited to welcome you to a few days of discussions and workshops where we're going to teach you about the power of private keys, both in Bitcoin and beyond. In 2020, Bitcoin hit all-time highs. Institutional adoption has swelled to levels we've never seen before. And amidst a global pandemic, the Bitcoin community has grown substantially. At Casa, we believe that private keys are a fundamental building block of Bitcoin that all new Bitcoiners should understand. We created Keyfest as a fun and educational way to spread that knowledge. Keys are the foundation of everything we do in Bitcoin, and they're inherently very personal. At Casa, we're building a personal key manager that allows you to take control of your financial life. Your private keys allow you, and only you, to have direct ownership of your money through Bitcoin. At Casa, we help you secure these keys so you can live your life with the peace of mind that your Bitcoin is secure. It's our third and final day of Keyfest, and we're excited to have Peter McCormack, the podcast host of What Bitcoin Did, Balaji Srinivasan, angel investor and entrepreneur, and Alex Gladstein, Chief Strategy Officer of the Human Rights Foundation, for our final conversation, Fortune or Tragedy, from escaping corrupt nation states to creating a digital utopia, how can private keys enable humanity's sovereign future?
Okay, Balaji, Alex, welcome both. I don't think we can start without mentioning the fact that Bitcoin is hovering a few dollars away from $40,000, which is mind-blowing to think that's essentially a 10x from the low of March the 12th. And really, a good starting point is, what does this actually mean? Like, how important, we'll start with you, Balaji, how important do you think price is in all of this? Does it validate things? Does it create a moat?
I mean, long-term price is very important because price represents the strength of an ideological movement. For the first time with crypto, you can actually measure. It's like, it's not a publicly traded company. It's like a publicly traded currency, but more like that, it's a publicly traded belief system in, the long-term validity. I think short-term fluctuations, people assign way too much, significance. Oh, people are selling because of this or buying because of that. But absolutely, price is a signal, and it's a signal of strength. I think also, by the way, this particular spike was relatively predictable in the sense that prices have tended to spike about 6 months after the halving, and that pattern has continued now for the last 3 times. So that was something that was relatively predictable, and I think we're just at the beginning of this run.
Alex, anything you want to add?
Yeah, price is so important because at the end of the day, Bitcoin is a technology that allows people to have a devaluation-proof savings mechanism, and that can protect them against debasement, seizure, censorship, all sorts of things. But at the end of the day, you have to focus under high-inflation regimes, whether it's Argentina or Turkey, Iran, Venezuela, over the last 6, 7, 8 into Bitcoin. And you compare that to local assets, or even just looking at the dollar, into black market dollars. This has been an incredible boon for them.
Alex, your connection is really struggling. I'm not sure if it's the same for you, Balaji, but it's very choppy for me. And I've checked with Emily. Do you want to try and take off your video? Oh, it's gone. Okay, so just you and I will carry on for the moment, Balaji. Okay, so people who are listening, we might have some people listening who are not completely familiar with the topic. So can you help people kind of understand, what does Bitcoin and private keys do to enable a sovereign individual, and what does it actually mean to be a sovereign individual?
Well, so the concept of a sovereign individual comes from the eponymous book called The Sovereign Individual, which has been very influential on Peter Thiel and Anderson and a bunch of folks. And The Sovereign Individual, it's worth buying. It's finally on Kindle and Audible. It wasn't for a long time, which is ironic because it predicted like this digital future. And among other things, it forecasted and in fact gave like a specification for Bitcoin. If you read it, it's possible that the person who invented Bitcoin, Satoshi, actually read the book because it nails so many aspects of what eventually became Bitcoin that he might have used it as a spec. But what is the concept? It essentially means that power shifts dramatically away from centralized institutions to individuals who are globally mobile, who are super empowered thanks to the internet and thanks to cryptocurrency, individuals that may have the resources of large groups, individuals that may be able to hit a key and not just automate a bunch of servers, but spin up a bunch of robots or order a bunch of goods flying from around the world. And what happens is essentially that many more transactions become consensual as opposed to coercive, and we enter a voluntary economy, a voluntary society, where almost everything that people do is voluntary rather than coerced. That's a totally different equilibrium from the one that we're currently in, and arguably have been for not just the last 500 years, but for most of humanity. And the book is well worth reading. I can't really summarize it in full, but a big concept there is that private keys are basically the key thing that changes the balance of power, because for the first time you have property that is defended not by having a greater ability to do violence, but by cryptography. And so it is not something where you're defending property anymore with the military. You're defending property with cryptography, such that it's just very difficult to solve a math problem, which unlocks the keys to your digital currency or digital assets. And no matter how many guns you have, you can't solve that problem. And so this is what Julian Assange, others have observed. No amount of violence can solve certain kinds of math problems, and the private keys are essentially the solution to those math problems. So it's just a totally different model for society, as disjunctive and disruptive as say the Industrial Revolution was from the farming economy, or farming was from the hunter-gatherer economy that preceded it.
When you consider that, though, and Alex, I'll bring you back in here. So we're just explaining exactly what private keys do to enable the sovereign individual. As we transition into this, I've interviewed people regularly where they talk about it's just not just going to be the case of governments are going to sit back and just potentially allow this. There's going to be different ways they can coerce people away from using certain technologies. What do you believe the threats are from the state with regards to people transitioning to become more sovereign as individuals? Right, I think we've still got problems with Alex there. So, Balaji, do you want to take that up?
Yeah, so I think that you're going to see, Hegelian dialectics ensue, in the sense of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, where the thesis is, the existing state, and the antithesis is the network, in the sense of both the social network and the cryptocurrency networks. And the synthesis are going to be network states of different kinds. So one version is a state like a China or an Israel or an Estonia, where their leaders essentially become software CEOs or have the skills of a software CEO and are able to implement, whether you call it surveillance or firewalls or whatever. China has this doctrine of internet sovereignty, where they say, look, if we can interdict physical packets crossing our borders, we should be able to interdict digital packets crossing our borders. And so we assert the right to essentially inspect every packet, physical or digital, that comes across our borders, and so on, right? That's their kind of framing of the problem. That's part of their national integrity. So that's like one model. Estonia or Israel, I think, are better models, which preserve some degree of freedoms, but are still very software savvy. And that's where a state is gaining kind of network capabilities. The opposite is where a network is gaining state-like capabilities. We haven't seen that yet, but I think that is going to be a very important model over the next few decades, where we've started new companies and new communities and now new currencies. Can we start new cities and new countries? I think that's where technology is going over the next 10 to 20 years, and that's something where a network would materialize into state form. And so that's how I kind of think things will happen. And you might say, well, what about legacy states that can't properly fuse with the network? Well, I think there's going to be some dramatic things that are going to happen, and they might happen much faster than anybody thinks. For example, if Bitcoin goes to $1 million, which now does not seem that unlikely that that's going to happen within our lifetimes, maybe even by the end of this year, it might crash back down. Who the heck knows? It's very unpredictable. But if that does happen, I think you're going to see a lot of people take this thing seriously at a different level. and it's going to be stress tested in many ways. I think there's going to be a tug of war and a seesaw back and forth, because you're also going to have newly hyper, super rich individuals that can, with a few Bitcoin, fund nonprofits, fund advocacy, defend individual rights. And so you are going to have this huge tug of war back and forth between the state and the network. One thing just to remember is the kinds of people who would get wealthy from BTC are the kinds of folks who made early aggressive bets against, the Fed and against, kind of the continued competence of the U.S. government, but did so in 2011 or 2012, many, many years before the present moment. So they were contrarian and correct. And that's just a very different kind of personality that currently runs, Western society, where they are populist and wrong, which is almost the exact opposite quadrant, right? So I think that that's going to be a huge, huge, huge thing. But importantly, it's not just the United States. This is going to play out over the rest of the world. And I have a feeling that it's going to turn out to be the rest of the world that ends up embracing crypto. Some will break ranks because they don't want to get caught in the US-China Cold War. And rather than being forced onto the dollar or the digital yuan as their payment rails, they may use these decentralized digital currencies because those are kind of demilitarized zones that no country can control. So these are a few of the bits of how geopolitics, I believe, are going to play out. But it's every edge case is going to be probed. Just think about the extent to which, Twitter, which was considered the most unimportant thing in the world 15 years ago, where people were tweeting breakfast. Millions and millions of people are hyper-focused on the mechanics of Twitter. Like they know what a favorite or a retweet, these edge case kinds of behaviors that some designer in San Francisco cooked up 15 years ago are now the focus of everybody's thing. So in the same way, people are going to be obsessing about difficulty parameters and just arcane features of Bitcoin and the blockchain in a few years. In the same way that crypto Twitter has for a long time, but it's just going to be weird when 10 or 100x as many people care about this stuff.
Do you think we will go through a transitional period as people start to realize, like we've talked about this recently, people could essentially move to more regulatory friendly states or regulatory friendly countries? Do you think we will potentially see a wealth, skill, and brain drain out of more liberal Western democracies? And could that lead to a weakening of countries like America and strengthening of countries like China? And is that itself a risk?
So I think it's going to strengthen the global South in the sense of, it's not just the US versus China. There's, that's obviously they're two big countries. That's about 20% of the world, right? Most of the world is neither American nor Chinese. And so what I think happens is, in a sense, the US has been brain draining lots of countries over the last 50 years, certainly India. And, look, it's been bilateral. It's not been a wholly one-sided thing. Both parties have gained out of it, I would argue. But certainly the US has been taking talent from everywhere, from Egypt, from Brazil, from Poland, all over the place. And there's an argument, I don't fully agree with that argument, but there's an argument that, okay, well, those folks should actually have been building up their own home countries or whatever, right? So people can make the nationalisty kind of argument on the other side of it. I believe that people should kind of go where they're welcomed. And if there's a country that is against, immigrants, or there's a country that's against, entrepreneurship, or both, which is unfortunately where the US seems to be heading, then it's not going to get immigrant entrepreneurs. And those countries that do want them will get them. And then in a sense, it's sort of glib, but everybody's happy because those people who didn't like immigrants and or entrepreneurs, don't have them, and those that do. And that's going to be where Moderna sets up, the next Moderna. That's going to be where the next startup set up, the next growth sets up. So I think that's just what's going to happen. And it's weird because you kind of have two sentiments at the same time. On the one hand, you have this sort of nationalist, socialist sentiment that says, get out of our city, techie or tech bro. And we hate you, and tech is ruining our city or whatever, or country. And then you also have something which says, oh my God, I can't believe you left. and those are, of course, not compatible sentiments. You can't say get out and I can't believe you left. But they're happening at the same time in SF, and I think you're going to see a similar kind of thing with the U.S. writ broadly. It's starting with SF and with California, but it's going to happen to the U.S. writ broad over the next, I think, 5 to 10 years.
Are there any real negative consequences of such a transition as well? So one of the things I can't help think about is that, you know, people like you or myself or other people we know, we've potentially been quite lucky to have been exposed to something like Bitcoin quite early, understand its benefits, to invest in it and to prepare ourselves. But as the dollar, say, weakens, or the euro weakens, or other currencies weaken, do we potentially head to a kind of like a two-tier global system of those who got into Bitcoin early and then those who didn't and are holding a very weak currency, and that will see a collapse? Is there any kind of negative consequences? Should we expect a bloody and kind of economically difficult transition, or do you think it will be smoother than that?
Well, so here's the thing. In an important sense, the rise of Bitcoin actually reduces power inequality, because before there was a group of people who had lots of dollars and they were powerful, and they were folks who, you know, for example, the Federal Reserve and all the nodes that are near it in the Cantillon effect sense, you know, the ones who got the bailouts first, who got the dollars first, right? And now you have two groups, right? You have reduced power inequality because you have the crypto people and you have the dollar people, right? And the other day, you know, Joe Weisenthal, you know, the stalwart on Twitter, he's made a joke a few times, which I think is funny, where, you know, playing on the term, let's say, Irish American or Indian American, you know, people called Pete Buttigieg last year a McKinsey American. So he's been using the term recently, which I think is funny, Bitcoin American, right? Like, you're a Bitcoin American. And I kind of joked with him, and I was like, actually, I think in the fullness of time, Bitcoin American will be like saying dollar British.
Okay.
Because it's, you know, the thing is that the internet, I believe, is analogous to the internet is to the USA what, you know, the Americas were to the UK, essentially a new world that is going to give rise to new countries. And, you know, Bitcoin will be the reserve currency of those countries, and or some of them, at least, things that are born on the internet and then attain physical form, you know, and I think that those places will probably have like a V2 or a V3 or a 2020 or rather 21st century version of Western values. But I don't think that, you know, when you talk about Bitcoin, like, you know, yes, it's true that folks who have Bitcoin early will do well. That's probably true at this point. But, you know, insofar as other folks are suffering for it, it's one of those things that is 100% a function of the people who are stewards of the current dollar regime. You know, as, you know, my friend Naval has said, like, you know, he kind of winces. Bitcoin goes up when other things go down because it's a hedge against that badness, right? And if those folks weren't abusing the system, then, you know, we would all be getting, you know, wealthy through other mechanisms like building companies or what have you, and we're all capable of doing that. But this is something where it's, I think we're fortunate there's a hedge on the system. Otherwise, just everybody would crash, right? And everybody, you know, we saw that in, you know, in Germany and Zimbabwe and in Venezuela and all these other places. So this is just a lifeboat, basically, that ensures that those people who made contrarian bets against the system early are empowered in the aftermath. And I think that that's basically the best way to think about it.
We got you back, Alex.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, great. So, Alex, we've been talking a lot here about Bitcoin and what Bitcoin enables. Obviously, a lot of your work is focused around the world, looking at people who are living under authoritarian regimes. Outside of Bitcoin, though, what other tools and technologies are helping people? I don't want to say sovereign individual and say someone like Saudi Arabia, because it's slightly more difficult. But what other technologies are enabling more freedom for people within these countries?
Yeah, well, just to you know, state what I was going to say at the beginning, and this probably rips off of some of what Balaji was saying, but the internet and our digital world is centralizing and is a highly centralized model. And Bitcoin and private keys give a hedge against that. I mean, we finally have a way for someone to actually own something in a sovereign way, in a way that can't be taken from them so easily, in a way that can't be debased or censored. And that is like a huge contradiction to the dominant centralized phenomenon of all these other technologies that we see, ranging from like AI to big data analysis to anything else like large corporations or governments use structured society to do social engineering, etc. So I think it's
You've cut again, Alex. I'm sorry, you're getting choppy again. It's very difficult to hear you. So I'm going to flip back to Balaji. So we're often utopian sometimes. I think about a future, a Bitcoin world. We talk about the benefits of voluntary relationships, of private property rights, the downfall of the state. But do we risk only thinking in a utopian way? Like, is there? Could we be creating a new world which in some ways maybe is worse? In some ways, if we had no state, that it could be slightly more lawless, could be dystopian in a different way. Is there that potential? Have we really thought this through?
I think, my one-liner on this is that the internet increases variance in everything. So, for example, Uber rides, the shortest Uber rides are much shorter than typical taxi rides, and the longest ones are much longer. We go from 30-minute sitcoms to 30-second, YouTube clips or 30-episode Netflix binges. You go from, a 9-to-5 job to somebody who is a billionaire by, their early 20s, or someone who is, a failure at home with their mom at, in their 40s, right? And so the internet is just increasing variance in everything. And the reason for that is the internet literally disintermediates whatever the middlemen were. Now you can go peer-to-peer and just go packet to packet. And you just apply that on every single sphere. And what it means is that what was in the middle, you could call it mediating or moderating. You could also call it mediocrity. And so what the internet will give you is it'll give you just things that are way better than what used to exist and far, far, far worse, Mm-hmm. And so you get, like Twitter is a great example. Like Paul Graham actually had a great tweet on this a while back, where Twitter has such a huge effect on the world in both positive and negative directions that it's very hard to add up the two terms and say, is it net positive? Because there's so many jobs, so much knowledge that you get out of Twitter. It's actually insane how much you can level up there professionally. And, there's topics you can learn about genomics, you can learn about, aeroastro, whatever you want to learn about, you can hear experts in the field talking about it. Like, the opportunity for learning is almost unparalleled. You could just hear all of these people, and it's a library, but it's also a civil war. And, you can apply this to lots of things, which are internet created. Now, I do believe that on balance, what we just need to do is figure out, it sounds like but we need to figure out how to create high pass filters that filter out the negative and only allow the positive through. That's by analogy to electrical engineering, where you have so-called, frequency domain filters that filter out, low frequency signals and allow high frequency signals through. But in this case, it'd be quality rather than frequency. I think that's possible once we think about that technologically. And it's not so much reintroducing the middleman, though I guess it kind of is, but it's a different kind of middleman because it's an opt-in middleman. It's one that you can choose to give, higher quality, right? So there's still a choice aspect to it. It's not just a higher variance. It's first you get higher variance. Now you have newly high quality as well as lower quality. And then you introduce new filters that people can opt into to get basically just uniformly higher quality. So that's, I think, what the mechanism that's happening, and a lot of the chaos that you see is from that disintermediation without the rebundling. Because, like as Jim Barksdale or Jim Clark once said, the only way to make money in business is by unbundling and bundling. And so you unbundle, like, you go from albums to MP3s, and then you rebundle with iTunes playlists, right? You unbundle from like newspaper articles into individual blog posts, and then you rebundle with like Twitter feeds. And you can apply that to lots of different areas in the internet where the previous structure didn't work, or it was suboptimal in some way, but people still want a structure, and so they just go to a new thing, which is an improvement over the old one, but it's like it looks kind of like the old one, and progress is along, it's like a corkscrew, like along the z-axis.
So are you saying right now we're essentially seeing also an unbundling and rebundling of governance and regulation, and therefore like we spoke previously about, I saw that presentation you did where you talked about in some ways, your voting with your feet is more powerful than the voting with the ballot. Are we essentially seeing that now? And all these different test cities and test states are essentially, are we A/B testing different regulatory environments and different governance structures?
That's exactly right. So, in fact, in, libertarian theory, there's these concepts that were totally impractical, like panarchy, Panarchy, or polycentric law. You can Google those things. And these were things that libertarian theorists came up with, which were like, hey, what if you could be at one location and have two different governments? And people are like, you guys are crazy. That's so insane. But two different governments with two different police forces, you're a lunatic, right? But now you've got Uber and Lyft, which are essentially two different taxi regulatory regimes that coexist in the same location, and that you can just swipe between them. And if you want, now they've converged in a lot of ways, but they do have differences. And if you prefer one regulatory regime versus another, you can so choose that. And the same is true for various payments companies and so on and so forth. A lot of companies, most people don't think of it this way, but whenever you have millions of people, let alone hundreds of millions of people in a marketplace like eBay, or on a payment service like PayPal, or even a messaging service like Gmail, you have to basically be a cloud regulator, because you're regulating commerce interactions of humans. And some of those humans are bad actors. And some of them are not bad actors, but they're just poor actors. And there's a difference between like a 0-star actor who's like trying to harm you versus a 2-star actor who's not trying to harm you, but just selling like a bad product, right? Those are two different things. But, bans of bad actors and ratings of, quality are both important. So these cloud regulators, you can reconceptualize, the Apple App Store is a cloud regulator. eBay is a cloud regulator. Amazon with its star reviews is a cloud regulator. Uber and Lyft are. And in this sense, regulation has gotten like unbundled and then rebundled, because taxi and hotel and those kinds of things were all very local. They didn't have databases. They certainly didn't have every single trip ever, every single ride ever. They didn't have credit card information for the driver and the passenger. They didn't have bilateral reviews. They didn't have real-time decommissioning. In a very real sense, these cloud regulators are not just better marketplaces, they're also better governments than what preceded them.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm just like gaming out my head. So it's a bit like having a marketplace there for where to live. I mean, I can't remember the name of that company when you were involved.
Teleport.
Yeah.
Sold it.
Teleport. You can actually,
yeah.
So you can look on there and you can look at the kind of things that are important to you. You can see reviews and ratings, and essentially that's what we're moving toward, like a marketplace for governance.
That's right.
Be an interesting thing.
Let's see if Alex, third time's a charm. Hopefully the audio works.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. We're talking about the marketplace for governance, Alex.
Okay.
I'll let Balaji go, because we've put you in the middle unless you...
Yeah, go. Finish your thought.
I thought it was... I'm fine. Why don't you jump in and I could talk about Teleport and Nomad List.
Yeah, so we're talking about the marketplace for governance, Alex, and how, I mean, especially the United States is a very good test for this, as we're seeing people now consider moving to Miami, Wyoming for crypto, and different places for different reasons, different companies. Obviously, with COVID, people have been stuck at home a lot, and they've realized they don't need offices, and they've become a little bit more mobile with their own ability to where they want to live and work and base their companies. How do you think this plays out in the more kind of authoritarian regimes? Is there an opportunity here to liberate people there?
If you think about the issue of refugees and people who flee conflict or authoritarianism through history, there is now a new possibility for them that their ancestors never had, which is the ability to bring their property with them. I have ancestors who survived the Holocaust, and when they left, they had brought nothing but the clothes on their back. And the fact that people today can leave Syria or leave Venezuela and convert their time and energy into a digital format and bring it with them and start a new life is completely revolutionary. And is something that people in years past wish they could have had. So that's why I kind of believe it's important to spread education and awareness about these tools, especially Bitcoin, in allowing people to basically get a piece of digital property that lives in cyberspace and then they can move jurisdictionally wherever, and then they can like withdraw from cyberspace and start a new life wherever they may be. And this contributes to what the sovereign individual predicted, right? That like people would basically vote with their feet and, you know, move to wherever they, you know, have the best chance at life. But before, honestly, you know, before Bitcoin and some of these other technologies, that was not so possible, right?
Sorry, actually, getting a bit choppy again towards the end. Okay, so Balaji, how much of this is going to be physical? How much virtual world? Because a lot of what was covered in the sovereign individual was also the virtual world, and a lot of the things that happen in Ready Player One are kind of interesting. What's the split between the two? How much of this future is in a virtual world?
Well, so I think 2020 is the year that the internet became primary and the physical world became the mirror, in the sense that, you know, people will always say, oh, well, physical is still valuable. Physical isn't going away. We're still physical people, you know, silly, right? And I'm like, yes, of course, physical is valuable, but physical is now the premium product. Everything that can happen digitally first will happen digitally first. Every meeting, every phone call, every business deal, everything that can happen digitally due to COVID, because COVID is going to go on for quite some time, will happen digitally first. It's like a forcing function that forces us digital. And basically, you know, if you remember back in the 90s, people would talk about this concept of the digital divide, where, you know, some people had, you know, communications devices and other people didn't. Now that billions of people around the world have smartphones, we're actually experiencing the opposite situation, which I would call the physical divide. And now the situation is that it is incredibly cheap to pack billions of transistors into a, you know, device, but it's expensive to put lots of people in the same room. And so it is now something, right, where physical has become expensive. And because physical is expensive, what you're going to see is everything starts digital first, including new cities and new countries. And the best of them get printed out in the real world. And I think that's a very powerful metaphor, the idea of printing out from the digital world. Of course, we can print out a PDF, but we can also 3D print something, right? We can hit enter and we can have something, you know, printed in the sense of DoorDash coming to our door with, you know, food, or Instacart with groceries, or Amazon with a package. You can hit enter and purely digitally it gets printed out. And you may say, well, that kind of stretches the concept of printing, right? You know, does you have a human in the loop? And I'd say today, yes, but each step of that process is being automated and mechanized. The warehouse is having robots, the delivery bot is having robots, the doors are being automated. All of those pieces are being automated. You can see a lot more of that in China, you know, like the sidewalk robots, things of that nature. And so it is not far away from the time. It already kind of happens, things like drop shipping, for example, where you hit enter. And, you know, if you think about what a printer is, it is a bunch of electromechanical components that are whirring, and, you know, it's like if it's an inkjet, it's dropping little droplets of ink, and so there's something mechanical happening. It's like a little robot, effectively, within the printer that is doing something for you. It certainly doesn't look like a humanoid robot, but it's a little robot nonetheless. And if you have 3 robots that are doing something for you, and their cost is only electricity, and the result is to deliver a package to your door, right? Like the diapers.com robots, if you've seen those, and then it's like a drone delivery kind of thing, right? Well, isn't that printing in a sense? It's a generalized sense of printing, right? You've just instructed a bunch of robots to go and materialize a physical object. So, you know, that is where things are going. I mean, if you look at vicarious.com, for example, you've probably seen Boston Dynamics. You know, robotics are really getting pretty impressive. Like, you know, we are really in the real future. And you can see when these kinds of things are that impressive, they're going to be that impressive everywhere by 2030. And then they'll have 1 billion robots or more by, you know, 2040. It's very obvious that is finally actually happening, as long as that took. You know, so I think that actually reduces the barrier to print something out from the digital world to the physical world. I'm not saying it's easy. Physical actuation is by no means a fully solved problem, and it won't be for a while. But what it does mean is everything starts digital first, and the best things acquire enough digital currency to print out in the physical world. And that's a very broad class of things.
Nice. Okay, we've got some viewer questions in. I just want to put to you. Okay, Balaji, do you think it would be possible to use biometric info to sign off with private keys. It would make it much harder to lose everything if you could associate a private key with your personal brainwave signature or something similar.
The problem with the biometrics is you can't do a password reset. You're not going to easily be able to change your fingerprints or your, like your face very easily. And so they're good for some things. And, Zengo, which I'm advisor to, it's a crypto wallet. It's quite good. It uses your face as sort of a backup to back up your private keys. And so I think as an adjunct to things, they can be useful. But I would be very cautious about a system where it's dependent entirely on them, because with AI, it's not that hard to make realistic face fakes and things of that nature. And I don't know enough about exactly how people are thinking about measuring brainwaves in this scenario. If it was something like the emotive or now the Neuralink headsets, it's probably possible to intercept that and record it and then simulate something that's like that. I don't know enough about the signal processing of that to give an informed opinion, but I wouldn't be surprised if it is possible, because it's possible for many other kinds of biological signals. So biometrics, I think, have to be very carefully thought through as to when you want a non-password resettable authentication mechanism. Because if somebody compromises your private key, in theory, you can just move the funds to something else fast enough before, so you have an option there, right? Someone compromises your face, you're basically SOL. This, by the way, is one of the reasons I think we're going to be re-encrypting the world. And we're in this weird transitional era where, real names, you don't usually think of them as a technology, but they are technology. And real names are a technology that was just not built for the internet. You were not built to have 1 billion people be able to stalk you and associate everything with you. Cancel culture is enabled by real names. So is discrimination in many ways. And so by going to pseudonyms stop both discrimination and cancellation. And I think what's going to happen is more and more people are going to move towards AI avatars, and you're only going to, just like you don't share your password with most people, sometimes not even with your spouse, very few people really actually need to know the association between your physical form and your digital avatars. You may just never tell anybody about that. And so you just keep, your personal life is just sports and working out, and people know you as Jim, and you never disclose your wealth or other kinds of things. A lot of it is just digital. And I think that's an interesting model of the world. It's not the only model, but it's a model which I call the re-encrypting, where you just re-encrypt everything so that we're just less vulnerable.
Did I see you the other day tweet, or you retweet, somebody talking about the rise of the anonymous influencer?
I did, yeah. Me and actually, I RT'd Blake IR on this, and we were both talking about it. The synonymous economy, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so the next one, I think you'll like this one. Well, you'll like to answer it anyway. How do you mitigate the level of poverty if only rich or big institutions own Bitcoin? I love the fact that you don't need to intermediate anymore, but in the end, only the early adopter or the rich people, corporation, will have control of the money.
Oh, yeah. So first is, I very much believe wealth creation is a non-zero-sum game. My simplest proof of that is we have billions of cell phones today, and we had basically zero 30 years ago, right? 40 years ago. So nobody looted those cell phones from each other. Nobody stole those cell phones. They're very valuable, but they were created. So wealth was created. It wasn't stolen. That's a very important concept, right? It's actually also very obvious when you look at software. What is software? It's just a pleasing combination of electrons. All you need is coffee and, like some snacks to move the electrons around and create Dropbox. And that's a valuable thing. You're literally creating wealth. And so once you abstract out wealth as useful order that you have created on the computer, and then you actually start thinking about natural resources as optional adjuncts to this order, right? Like, the paper of the paper mill or the sand of the beach, it's only through that program, which could be a factory assembly line, that you're turning that raw material into something useful. That's how the order, is imposed on this collection of basically rubbish into something that humans find valuable. Once you realize wealth can be created, well, then you start thinking about, okay, does this technology on net boost wealth creation versus not? So if, for example, there was a technology that got everybody hooked on opioids, that would probably be bad. That would probably not net boost wealth creation. People would be, doped out of their minds. But Bitcoin isn't like that. I think it's the opposite. I think it's going to unlock enormous amounts of wealth creation around the world for lots of reasons. one of the most important is it just hobbles the welfare warfare state. People have talked about this, but essentially all the money printing that is done, one of the things that might be obvious, but just useful for people to understand, when the US government prints tons of money, it's actually a nationalist thing where they're diluting all non-American dollar holders to benefit Americans. And those non-American dollar holders are typically poorer than them, and those are people who are using the dollar as a technology platform. Maybe they're in Venezuela, they're trying to use it as a lifeline, and it's being diluted out from underneath them. Now, it's often denied that this printing actually does that, but it does, because it's literally the Cantillon effect. It's actually it's one of those things that if people are denying that, it's hard to argue with them on anything else. You can probably get them to admit it in the context of a capitalization table for a company, but they won't admit it for it's a reserve currency, it's all magic. It doesn't mean anything. So A, it's nationalist in that sense, and B, it's nationalist in a different sense, which is it funds basically infinite war, because printing, dilutes folks down. So I think that, you subtract those kinds of things, that in itself is a huge unlock of wealth creation. But it's more as well because, crypto broadly, and I know this is a Bitcoin only forum, so I'm not going to mention any other cryptos, but, I would consider myself like a freedom maximalist, more than any particular technology. And you know what I mean, for a long time, I think I've been consistent in that, right? And what I care a lot about is there are lots of people around the world who are in countries that were just crushed in the 20th century, that were going through the kinds of things the US is going through now, that had, weird strongmen or, like disorderly transitions or whatever. And lots of people fled those countries, right? They fled Vietnam, they fled China, they emigrated from those places. Many of them came to America, many of them came other places. And now a lot of those people are getting online, and crypto and technologies like that allow us to employ them, to have the smartphone be a skyhook, a skyhooked opportunity. That's also true, by the way, in the Midwest of the US, in overlooked places in the US, not just the blue cities where all of this wealth is concentrated. Anywhere around the world, both within the United States and outside of it, crypto provides the possibility of an opportunity. Ideally, anywhere there's a phone, there's a job. So I do believe that it's got massive wealth creation effects, but we have to sort of get through the present moment. One thing Deng Xiaoping actually said a long time ago was, let some people get rich first. And essentially what he was saying was, under communism, everybody all had to be equally poor. And to let some get rich first was a very carefully chosen thing, where he, that word at the end, first, says, okay, you'll also get rich, just wait your turn, or, like, allow some people to get there first, and don't be too envious of them, because a rising tide will lift all boats, which did happen in the long run. Alex, go ahead.
No, I was just saying I could try one more time.
Go ahead.
How much time have we got left of you, Balaji?
I've got another 10 minutes, I think. Hopefully, yeah.
So, Alex, one of the questions I put to Balaji, which I'd also like to hear your opinion on, is there a chance that these technologies are used in the wrong way, and these technologies lead to a more dystopian future?
Yeah, of course. However, they are built in such a way that checks the power of authoritarianism, because it empowers individuals over the large organization. You have, for example, encrypted communications, and you could say, oh, it helps the dictator communicate with his family secretly, but that's missing the forest for the trees. Much more powerfully, it allows the millions of people who live under the dictatorship to communicate privately with each other. So yes, dictatorships will take advantage of Bitcoin, for example, and they will route around the dollar system. But over time, it will erode their ability to control the economy, and it will reduce the arbitrary power they can wield over their citizens. And that's why it's such an important technology.
So it's almost like a short-term gain, as we've seen the government of Venezuela is mining Bitcoin. We've just heard that Russia's mining Bitcoin. We know Iran's used Bitcoin. But as the state becomes reliant upon it, devaluing their own currency. Is this what you're saying? They're devaluing their own currency?
Well, Bitcoin won't save dictatorships, but it will save the individual. Complicated social architectures cannot be saved simply by a savings technology or by private communications. They require coordination from many different actors. But citizens or individuals can benefit tremendously.
Alex, I'm not sure if we covered this before you went off, but what are the other key tools that are being used by people living under oppressive regimes? We know, but we've talked about Bitcoin. We know Signal's important technology. What other technologies?
I mean, those are probably the two most important ones right now, meaning encrypted money and encrypted communications. I personally think we are a little ways off from other kinds of sovereign technologies. We're just not quite there yet. Like, obviously, a decentralized VPN would be very helpful, right? And, we have the Tor browser, which is a good start, but there exists no commercial level equivalent that works at scale, that's decentralized. So you could start thinking about where we could go. But today, for people living under these corrupt nation states, encrypted communications and encrypted money are absolutely important tools to learn about today, to start with.
Okay. Balaji, I've got another question from somebody watching. They've asked, how can they join a network country?
Followed by Twitter feed. We're going to be there's going to be some stuff on that, but basically, I have a book that I've been writing. Tentative title is The Network State, on how you would go about extending the ideas behind cryptocurrencies to crypto cities and crypto countries. With the idea being, how would you actually do a digital first thing that allows you to form an alternative? In the very short version, I actually tweeted this some time ago. I'll give the city version. Is how to start a new city, build a community in the cloud, organize the economy around remote work, enforce laws with smart contracts, practice in-person norms of civility. So you have an acceptance and application procedure. It's more like a company, simulate the architecture in VR. VR architecture is radically advanced beyond where most people think. Eventually crowdfund territory and materialize that city into the real world. And none of those steps are impossible. What hasn't happened is to compose them all together and have that intent from the beginning of building a community that is not simply a Game of Thrones Facebook group, but that intends to materialize something real into the physical world. And that sense of purpose is very important, and crypto provides the liquidity for people to be able to do that. So that's how I think about crypto cities. And cities are a good target for the next 10 years because there's nothing illegal about starting a city. There's unincorporated land. There's a process for turning into incorporated land in the US. There's lots of bare territory out there. And what the internet lets you do and what Starlink lets you do is it lets you go and settle barren land, and you can just do Burning Man anywhere. So I think that's going to be a big thing. I was an investor, first LP in Pronomos, a fund that was focused on this, and I've been funding a bunch of startup cities around the world, and we'll probably do something on that. And then in terms of crypto countries, it's extending the ideas behind startup cities, but you're going one step further. And if I think, startup cities are the 2020s, startup countries will be like the 2030s network states, because you have to sort of build towards that. But when you start talking about new countries, you're getting into a realm of, okay, how is that even possible? I know how to start a new city. It's more like Bitcoin, where how do you even start a new currency, right? Like it wasn't an obvious thing. Do you go petition the IMF? How do you actually go about doing that? Imagine going and pitching a VC in 2009. I'm going to start a new currency. I mean, I guess, Peter Thiel kind of did with PayPal, where he said, I'm going to start a new digital currency, but it didn't quite call it like that. Called it a payment system, which people could wrap their heads around. So I think, the way to start new countries begins with the observation that by 2013, for example, if you recall, BTC was a ticker symbol or USD BTC rather, that exchange rate was listed on Bloomberg and CNBC, which was like this amazing moment. I'm not sure if you were following it then. Gladstein, were you in the space in 2013?
I was not following the ticker drama.
Okay, well, so the OGs or whatever, there's a list called XGBTC, ex Googler BTC. Jameson might be on it, where folks were like, "Holy cow! I can't believe this pure internet phenomenon was being featured on Bloomberg and CNBC." It's hard to remember now, but it's sort of like the feeling that you had where you're like, "Oh my God, the New York Times printed a tweet." Now, of course, that's what the New York Times is: a collection of juicy narratives, and a collection of tweets, right? But back in the day, that was an unusual thing. Okay, what's my point? Point is that I think a similar mechanism will happen for crypto countries. If you look at the United Nations, about 30% of countries have a population less than 1 million, and about 60% have a population less than 10 million. That's actually not that big when you calibrate that in terms of a social network. There's a lot of individual influencers who have followings that are larger than that. Now, the intensity of those followings is certainly not as high as it is in terms of citizens of a country. But we have seen that with cryptocurrency, you can have fairly high, we're talking all of your net worth levels of intensity of association online. And so what I believe is going to happen is we're going to start seeing 1 to 10 million person cities that start materializing out of the cloud and that eventually start petitioning for membership in the UN. And there's other versions of this where you have a fractal polity, where it's like distributed around the world like Google offices, and its capital is in VR, so it can never be invaded. But it's got projections down in the physical world. 85, 90% of it's in VR, but you have VR, physical projections, neighborhoods like Chinatowns or Little Indias all around the world. And in a sense, this is just ethnic diasporas all over again, but it's a different version because it's like ideological diasporas, like vegans or CrossFitters, people who have shared communities, people who want to, let's say, revive Latin, just like the Israelis revived Hebrew. I think those kinds of things will come together. There'll be purposeful communities. It won't just be like money making or what have you. There'll be philosophical, there'll be religious, there'll be spiritual goals for these kinds of things, because that, I think, is a big part of what's missing for people. Much more on this coming, so just follow me on Twitter if you're interested in this type of stuff.
All right, Alex, we're coming to an end now. Just a kind of final question here I've got.
I'm gonna go, guys. So this was great.
Bye, Balaji. You can see him, man. Just reflecting on everything that happened in the Capitol yesterday. Do you think that's a reflection on how governance has not really evolved at the same speed of? It's kind of not kept up with the internet in that we're all a lot closer to politics now because we have 24-hour news, we have Twitter, we're all talking, we're all close to each other. Yet the way we tend to govern is very similar to what we've done for decades. Do you think that's kind of yesterday what happened is like a highlight of that we need to move to a different governance structure in any way at all?
Democratic governance is very messy. It's not so clean as what the Communist Party is doing in China. And I think yesterday was the outcome of unpoliced, unenforceable social trends that are happening. And thankfully, at least as an American, it's good to see that the law and the principles are winning out, it seems, where they quickly regained control, and we proceeded to follow the laws and regulations that have been set up by our Constitution, and that we are going to move forward in that way. There are many other countries and societies that I don't think survived such a moment. There have been many similar moments that have really taken down other polities. So at the end of the day, the rule of law and the sort of social consensus that we have around the Constitution is just really, really strong, and I think we'll protect Americans in many ways, but nothing lasts forever. So I do think that we have to keep an eye out on how these governance models are changing. But ultimately, I'm a big believer in democracy and in liberal democracy specifically. And, I think that most societies, are, on a track towards being more open. And what drives being more open is having checks against those in power. So, we are, I think, still on this long-term trajectory of having societies where individuals and groups are able to check the power of the state and of the corporation, and encrypted messaging and Bitcoin And all the things that public key cryptography made possible are helps there. They're big helps.
Just before we close out, you've obviously missed a bunch of this because unfortunately your connection. Were there any particular parts of the session that you were wanting to talk about? Any parts that you particularly wanted to talk about, or points you wanted to get across before we finish off? Because I feel like you missed so much of this, but I know you will have prepared for
it. Just reading into the title of Fortune or Tragedy, and I'm sure that this got covered, and I mentioned it before, but maybe I got cut off. I think that people are underestimating the technological transformation here with regard to how Bitcoin can enable freedom of movement. Again, when you flee conflict or war or dictatorship, you can only flee with what you have. And most people have their assets locked up in a financial system or property system controlled by the regime. And when they flee, they bring very little with them. That is changing. That is changing. And you cannot understate how important that is. So you can now, in any country on earth pretty much, convert your family's time and energy into a digital format, bring it with you, and start a new life somewhere else. And this is no panacea. It's not going to solve the problems that people flee, but it gives optionality, and it is just a remarkable invention that it has benefited so many. So I think that that's sort of just what I would like to conclude on. It's worth studying, and you are probably underestimating the importance of this shift in people being able to have sovereign digital control over their assets and being able to convert them into cyberspace and then access them later in a different location. It's kind of obsoleting your citizenship in a way. Like you can just flee whatever country you're in, and you can start a new life somewhere else much more easily with this invention. So I would say it's pretty historic, and it's a pretty exciting time.